The role of religious zeal in the Crusades. The Crusades, spanning from the late 11th century to the 13th century, were fundamentally motivated by religious zeal. Religious fervor was not only a driving force for the participants but also a key component in framing the Crusades as holy wars sanctioned by God. This zeal was deeply interwoven with political, social, and economic factors, but at their core, the Crusades were inspired by the belief in the sanctity of the mission to reclaim Jerusalem and protect Christianity. This exploration examines the profound role that religious zeal played in the Crusades, focusing on the religious motivations behind the campaigns, the role of the Church, and the impact of religious fervor on the participants and their societies. 1. Religious zeal as the primary motivation for the Crusades. The Crusades were framed by both the Church and secular leaders as divinely ordained missions, compelling thousands to take part in these military campaigns with the belief that their actions would result in spiritual rewards. Pope Urban II's call to arms, 1095. Pope Urban II's speech at the Council of Clermont in 1095 marked the formal beginning of the First Crusade, which called on Christians to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. He framed the crusade as a holy war, calling it a just war against the infidels, Muslims, who had occupied the holy sites of Christianity. The Pope emphasized the importance of defending Christendom and promised plenary indulgence, granting forgiveness for sins to those who took up the cross. This act of spiritual redemption was a central motivator for many crusaders. Religious ideals of the Crusaders. Crusaders saw themselves as soldiers of Christ, Miles Christie, warriors fighting not for personal gain but for the defense and expansion of the Christian faith. The idea of sacred war was bolstered by the Church, which portrayed the Crusades as acts of divine will, aimed at liberating Jerusalem, a city sacred to Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Crusaders were inspired by the concept that by participating in the Crusades, they could secure eternal salvation, making the campaigns more than just military endeavors but sacred acts. 2. The religious ideology of the Crusaders. Crusaders as pilgrims. For many participants, the Crusades were seen as an armed pilgrimage. Pilgrimage was a deeply ingrained religious practice in medieval Europe, and the Crusades transformed it into a collective and militarized effort to recover the holy sites. Jerusalem, the ultimate destination, was considered the spiritual heart of Christianity. Reclaiming it from Muslim control was seen as a divinely sanctioned mission. The concept of holy war and justification of violence. Crusading was rooted in the Christian concept of just war, bellum justum, as defined by St. Augustine and later developed by theologians like Thomas Aquinas. War was justified when waged in defense of the faith or for the protection of the innocent. In the case of the Crusades, it was framed as a righteous cause, justified by the defense of Christian holy sites and the protection of Christian pilgrims. The promise of spiritual rewards. One of the central motivators for Crusaders was the indulgence granted by the Pope. Those who participated in the Crusades were promised the forgiveness of sins, as well as the assurance of eternal life in heaven. For many, this promise of absolution was a powerful incentive, particularly for knights and nobles who had lived lives marked by violence and sin. The idea of penance was central to the crusading ideology, with participation in a crusade seen as a form of atonement for one's sins. 3. The role of the Church in promoting religious zeal. The Catholic Church was the primary institution that not only legitimized the Crusades but also fueled the religious zeal that drove the campaigns. Papal authority and leadership. The Pope, as the spiritual leader of Christendom, used his influence to rally Christian forces for the Crusades. Pope Urban II's call for the First Crusade was framed as a mission to defend the Christian faith, and subsequent popes continued to endorse and organize crusading efforts throughout the 12th and 13th centuries. The Church offered the sacred sanction for the Crusaders' actions, framing the Crusades as an essential religious duty. Crusading, preaching, and propaganda. Religious leaders, such as Bernard of Clairvaux, played a crucial role in promoting the Crusades, using sermons and religious rhetoric to inspire people to join. Preaching for the Second Crusade, 1147. Bernard of Clairvaux encouraged the nobility to participate in the holy mission by emphasizing that the Crusades were divinely ordained and offered an opportunity for spiritual redemption. Crusading propaganda often depicted the Crusaders as saints or martyrs, framing their military actions as acts of divine will. Creation of military orders. The Crusades gave rise to the military orders, such as the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, which combined monastic vows with military service. These orders became instrumental in defending Crusader territories and protecting Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. These orders operated under papal authority and became symbols of religious commitment and martial prowess, reflecting the religious zeal of the crusading movement. 4. The role of religious zeal in motivating participants. The role of nobles and commoners. While nobles were motivated by a combination of religious zeal, the desire for land, and the potential for wealth, many commoners were drawn to the Crusades by the religious promise of salvation. The People's Crusade, 1096, led by Peter the Hermit, saw a mass movement of peasants and lower-class individuals who believed that their participation in the Crusades would guarantee spiritual rewards, martyrdom, and heroic sacrifice. The idea of martyrdom and being a martyr for Christ was a key element in the religious zeal of the Crusades. For many participants, dying in battle for the defense of Jerusalem or the faith was seen as the ultimate sacrifice. This concept of martyrdom became central to Crusader identity, with Crusaders often celebrating their ultimate goal of serving Christ through battle and sacrifice. Religious zeal in the face of adversity. Crusaders faced immense hardships, harsh terrain, disease, and the formidable forces of the Islamic world. Yet their faith often kept them motivated. Religious zeal served as a source of strength, with many Crusaders believing that their struggle was divinely ordained and protected by God. 7. The Crusades and the evolution of religious tolerance and intolerance. The Crusades left a complex legacy of religious intolerance, but they also planted the seeds for future efforts at religious tolerance, dialogue, and coexistence. Religious intolerance. Persecution of Muslims, Jews, and heretics. The Crusades encouraged religious intolerance, particularly against Muslims, Jews, and non-Catholic Christians, such as the Eastern Orthodox and the Cathar. The People's Crusade, 1096, part of the First Crusade, saw large-scale massacres of Jewish communities in the Rhineland, as Crusaders viewed Jews as enemies of Christendom. The Crusaders' brutal conquest of Jerusalem in 1099 included the massacre of Muslims and Jews, which reinforced a cycle of violence and religious animosity. During later Crusades, Muslims were described as infidels, and the violent religious rhetoric of Crusader preachers further inflamed the animosity between Christians and Muslims. Attempts at religious tolerance and dialogue. Saladin's mercy. While the Crusades led to deep divides, moments of Christian-Muslim interaction revealed the potential for religious tolerance. Saladin, the Muslim leader who recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, offered mercy to the city's Christian inhabitants, allowing them to leave safely or live peacefully under Muslim rule. His actions contrasted sharply with the Crusaders' treatment of captured Muslims, showing a more nuanced approach to religious coexistence, which has been remembered as an example of mercy and tolerance. Impact on interfaith dialogue. The Crusades, despite their violent and divisive nature, helped foster early forms of interfaith dialogue between Christian and Muslim leaders. These exchanges often occurred in the midst of conflict, but laid the groundwork for later attempts to understand one another across religious lines. 8. The Crusades and their influence on the development of European thought. The religious fervor of the Crusades also influenced the development of European thought, particularly in the realms of theology, philosophy, and law. Theological and philosophical developments. Scholasticism. The Crusades brought many Europeans into contact with Muslim scholars and philosophers, particularly those in Spain and Sicily, whose works were based on Greek and Roman knowledge preserved and expanded by Islamic scholars. The introduction of these works, including the writings of Avicenna and Averroes, influenced major European thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas, who synthesized Aristotle's philosophy with Christian theology, contributing to the development of scholasticism. These intellectual exchanges helped lay the foundations for the Renaissance, as Greek and Roman ideas were reintroduced to Europe. The role of universities. The intellectual exchange spurred by the Crusades helped lead to the establishment of medieval universities in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, which became centers of learning, where scholars studied not only theology but also philosophy, law, and the natural sciences. These universities became influential institutions, contributing to the growing intellectual culture of Europe and encouraging critical thinking and debate that would later define the Enlightenment. 9. The Crusades and the evolution of European institutions. The Crusades helped to shape the political and social structures of medieval Europe, influencing the development of institutions that would play crucial roles in later European history. Church and state relations. Papal authority. The Crusades were, in part, an effort to strengthen papal authority over the European monarchs. The Church's ability to call for and organize the Crusades demonstrated its political influence, as popes were able to unite monarchs and nobles under a single cause. The success and failures of the Crusades